Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very exciting webinar. My name is Hyshyama Hamin, and I'm currently in the beautiful island of Sri Lanka. I am the campaign coordinator for Musawah's Campaign for Justice in Muslim Family Laws. I will be moderating today's webinar on Muslim family law reform in an age of crisis. We're really honored that you could join us today and hope that wherever you're joining from, that you and your families are safe and healthy. I'd like to have my team pull up the housekeeping slide, please. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. This webinar will be in English and the Arabic interpretation is available. Just click on the globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says interpretation and switch to the Arabic audio channel. You might have to experiment with it a little bit in order to get the right channel. Don't forget to mute the original audio. To improve accessibility, we also have closed captioning available for this webinar. For everyone joining us via Zoom, all participants will be muted. You may use the chat function to ask questions, which I, together with my team on the back end, will be sorting through and asking the speakers at the Q&A round in the last half hour. The event is also being live streamed via our Facebook page, facebook.com/Musawah-movement/live. And will be available on our YouTube channel as well in case any of your friends or colleagues want to view it later. If you are posting or tweeting about this webinar on social media, that's fantastic and we highly encourage it. Please don't forget to use the hashtag #FreeOurFamilyLaws and tag Musawah in your social media, and we will definitely amplify those tweets and posts as well. So let us begin. If the panelists could kindly switch on their videos, that would be great. And I will, yep, fabulous, thank you. So in May 2020, as COVID-19 was becoming a household topic around the world, and as people were asked by our governments to go home and stay home, Musawah launched our Campaign for Justice in Muslim Family Laws in recognition of the inequalities and discrimination that women living under Muslim family laws face with regard to marriage, divorce, and family matters, but also as a campaign that's culminating out of a historic sisterhood of Muslim women from all around the world who are fighting for and advocating for justice and equality within their own communities and countries. Through the Campaign for Justice in Muslim Family Laws, we're really attempting to build a global momentum to put family laws on the top agenda of governments and the international community and treaty bodies, as well as our very own women's rights movements and human rights movements, and to really accelerate reforms of Muslim family laws towards equality and justice. In an attempt to co-create this campaign together with national activists and advocates from around the world, and to share and listen and learn from each other while also celebrating our journeys and successes, Musawah is currently, and today is day one, hosting the global conference on Muslim family laws starting today. This webinar is in fact the first of 4 public sessions as part of the conference. And if you log on to our conference website, which is not up yet due to a few technical glitches, it happens, and it will be up shortly, you will get all this information, including the list of speakers and resources, and we'll also be able to see our wonderful art curation of women activists and artists, as well as register for the upcoming sessions. But up until that happens, please do feel free to follow us on Twitter, on Instagram and Facebook, as well as check out our usual website, musawah.org, to get all this information. So I will introduce our wonderful panelists first before I begin battering them with questions. Our panelists today are strangers to no one, really. Zainah Anwar co-founded 2 groundbreaking women's rights groups that engage with Islam from a rights perspective. She's the founding member and the executive director of Musawah. She's also the founding member and the former executive director of Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian NGO working on women's rights within an Islamic framework. She's a prolific writer, speaker, and an activist of women's rights. And Zainah has also received several awards, including the latest the United Nations Malaysia Award in 2019. Marwa Sharafeldin is an Egyptian scholar and activist. She has a PhD in law from the University of Oxford and is our MENA region expert at Musawah. Her work covers the intersections between Islamic law, international human rights and feminist activism. She's been published in a number of academic books and media platforms covering these topics. Fun fact, she's also a story collector, performer, and a writer, and might I add, an extraordinary spoken word poet. And Hala AlKarib is an activist and gender research practitioner from Sudan. She's currently in Toronto, where it's very early in the morning. So thank you, Hala. She is the regional director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, or SIHA, and the editorial head of the annual journal Women in Islam. Hala's activism specifically focuses on women and girls' rights, refugees, displaced persons, and challenges faced by minority communities. She has wide and comprehensive expertise on the Horn and Eastern African regions, and we'll be talking to her more about that today. So I would like to begin my questions. And Zainah, really, I'd want to ask you the first question. Please help us set the stage for this webinar by sharing with us information about Musawah's decade-long research and advocacy on Muslim family law reforms. What does the global picture on Muslim family law reform look like? And what appears as some of the main family law related issues that are cross-cutting in these Muslim family laws? Over to you, Zainah.
Thank you very much, Hish, for that introduction. Really, over the past 10 years, Musawah has built a huge body of work on Muslim family laws. Through our interventions in the CEDAW process, especially on Article 16 on marriage and family, we have gathered data on the areas of discrimination against women living in Muslim contexts and the ways governments use Islam to justify these discriminations and resist demands for law reform. We have built Muslim family law tables for 33 countries and also a positive developments table to show that reform has actually taken place and continue to take place in several Muslim countries. This table is particularly important as it debunks the myth that governments and religious authorities like to peddle that Muslim family law is divine law, is God's law, and therefore cannot be challenged or changed. The fact is, Muslim family laws have changed and continue to change to reflect changing times and circumstances over the centuries. Our research shows that over 45 countries in the world have some form of codified Muslim family law or uncodified practices. And of course, no two family laws anywhere in the world are exactly the same. What does this mean then? Well, the source of the law may be the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet. The result of human engagement with the source has led to different interpretations, understandings of Islam that led to different and diverse provisions in the law governing marriage and family life. These laws that govern us in ways that often are discriminatory towards women are indeed man-made laws, M-E-N actually, yeah, not divine law. So what have we learned from our research and work on the ground on Muslim family laws? This work includes some key findings. For example, number one, many areas of discrimination in Muslim family laws exist until today and remain resistant to change. In countries with plural legal systems, it is particularly outrageous that citizens of other faiths governed by civil law are recognized as equals, but Muslim women in the name of Islam are regarded as inferior and under the authority of men. These discriminations in law and practice occur at the time when women enter into marriage, during marriage, and at the end of marriage. Let me quickly give you some examples. For example, discrimination entering into marriage. Many countries have not established the minimum age of marriage at 18. That's like a basic human right, yeah? Those that have it provide exceptions, which means in effect, child marriage is still allowed. And in overwhelming number of cases, it is the girl child who is married off to much older men. Many countries provide for unequal ages of marriage for males and females, with a lower age for girls. Many countries still require that women need the permission of a male guardian, a wali, to marry, even if she is in effect the main breadwinner in the family. Number 2, discrimination during marriage. Polygamy is still permitted in almost all Muslim majority countries and in minority Muslim contexts. The legal framework of marriage still regards the husband as the head of the family to whom the woman owes obedience. A woman's failure to obey nushuz can be used to deny her the right to maintenance. Many women suffer domestic violence in silence because of the continuing prevalent belief that in Islam, a man has a right to discipline his wife, which in practice means beat his wife. Third, discrimination after marriage. Major areas of discrimination remain here. A husband's right to unilaterally divorce his wife without cause, women's unequal right to divorce, no share in the matrimonial assets, no right to guardianship of children. Women lose custody of children after they reach a certain age or if the women remarry, while the man never loses his right to guardianship even if they fail to maintain their children or even visit them. So besides discrimination in law, women also face discrimination in accessing justice. So even if women have rights under the law, there's culture and gender bias in the court system that actually prevent them from easily accessing those rights. Really, the list goes on. Hish.
Thanks, Zainah. But when it comes to the global picture on Muslim family laws, it's not all negative.
Are you on mute? Hish,
sorry, can you hear me?
I think.
No, you can hear me. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. No,
Sorry.
that's fine. When it comes to the global picture on Muslim family laws, Zainah, it's not all negative. In fact, if there was one key takeaway, it's that the reforms to Muslim family laws has been happening for decades. And Musawah has also been tracking these positive developments in legislation, in procedure, in practice. Can you share with us some examples of this? And I think we have a slide up on some of this that you'll be sharing as well.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, while the list of discrimination is long, there is also hope. What gives us hope is the incredible diversity of laws and practices that exist in many, many countries. In almost all the key areas of discrimination against women, there also exist practices that are more just for women and trends in law reform to advance equality and justice. So Musawah actually then developed a table on positive developments in Muslim family law to showcase this, that indeed in the name of justice in Islam, some countries have far more progressive laws than practice in some other countries. Let me give you some examples. In Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, Egypt, Turkey, Muslim women do not need a male guardian, a wali, to enter into marriage based on the Hanafi tradition. And what more, countries like Morocco and Tunisia, which follow the Maliki tradition, adopted the Hanafi fiqh to grant women equal right to marry without a male guardian. In Tunisia and Turkey, polygamy is banned. In Malaysia, Indonesia, Morocco, Jordan, and others, polygamy is restricted with conditions that the husband must fulfill. In many other countries, especially in the Arab world, polygamy is a ground for divorce. In Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, based on urf, custom, a valid source of law in Islamic legal theory, a woman's unpaid care work as wife and mother entitles her to a share of the matrimonial assets. So even if she has not financially contributed to the acquisition of the assets, she has a right to a share of the assets. In many countries, the law on custody of children today recognizes the best interest of the child, that enables mothers to maintain custody of their children even after the children have reached that maximum age that where they go to their fathers, or if the mother remarries. So if it's in the best interest of the child to stay with the mother, the child can stay with the mother. In Indonesia, Kenya, Singapore, and Turkey, Muslim women can also obtain the right to guardianship of their children. In others, if you get custody, you're also entitled to apply for guardianship. Best interest of the child is a principle that is already commonly accepted in many Muslim countries. What all these diversity and differences in law and practice point out is that reform towards equality and justice is possible. That these so-called Islamic laws are actually human-made laws, open to challenge, open to change, to reflect what equality and justice mean in the 21st century, in today's realities. Given different times and circumstances, Islamic laws can actually, do actually change so that justice and fairness can prevail. But of course, we know too often men with power and authority over us and are privileged by these patriarchal laws are opposed to change. Really, if the Muslim world, I always say this, had honored the ethical message of Islam that insistently enjoins justice, compassion, kindness, goodness, we would be at the forefront of the feminist revolution today. Alas, that is why today you see women taking the lead in many Muslim countries or contexts. It's up to us to organize, mobilize, and to assert our voice and claim our right to be treated as human beings of equal worth and dignity. We are the ones who suffer the impact of these discriminations for hundreds of years. We just will not wait anymore for change to be handed over to us on a silver platter, because that's not going to happen. We need to fight for it.
Thank you so much, Zainah. I think we unfortunately lost your video feed, but really thank you for laying the groundwork and showing us this diversity of both, yes, discrimination, absolutely, but also, you know, a rich history of reforms that we can capitalize on in order to move forward. In order to situate the campaign for justice and really our struggle to achieve justice and equality in Muslim family laws within this pandemic year, that is 2020, and take into account how women living under Muslim family laws are being impacted, Musawah recently concluded drafting a policy paper which documented survey responses from activists from 12 countries in the MENA and Asian regions with regard to issues pertaining to Muslim family laws, access to justice, relevant government and civil society response, and also activist recommendations for action in order to alleviate some of this discrimination that we're currently seeing. Marwa, I'd like to turn to you with this question. What does the evidence show us, both in the MENA region on what you've specifically written about, but also through the Musawah survey and report findings on how women living under discriminatory Muslim family laws, which Zainah spoke about, are being impacted during this time? If you could elaborate on that a bit for us, please.
Sure, thank you, Hish. So, of course, women in Muslim family law contexts have been impacted in a variety of ways. We have seen the alarming spike in domestic violence all over the world and in our own Muslim societies too, where in some countries calls to helplines have increased by 100% during the pandemic. So we know from one, the Musawah COVID-19 survey, two, other global reports, and three, our own advocates on the ground, that domestic abuse, child marriages, marital rape, forced marriages, so-called honor killings, female genital mutilation, and suicide of women are all going up in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question is, what has that got to do with Muslim family law? Well, research shows us that there is a clear link between gender inequality and domestic violence. The more inequality, the more likelihood of violence. Many Arab and Muslim family laws not only contain provisions that promote an unequal relationship between the spouses, but they also condone varying levels of violence. Let me give you some examples. So some of these laws still allow differing degrees of wife disciplining, which is also known as beating by the husband, child marriage, mitigation of penalties on so-called honor killings. None of these laws actually criminalize marital rape, and some still exonerate the rapist upon his marriage to the victim. These laws make it much harder for women to divorce than men, and require wives' obedience to their husbands, who have the right to restrict women's movements and their access to education, work, legal services, and signing of contracts. Now, when we look at the definition of violence against women in the United Nations 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, we find that it exactly applies to these kinds of provisions already found in our Arab and Muslim family laws. These laws are actually normalizing violence during ordinary times against women. And so during extraordinary times, when crises like COVID-19 hit, the ground is already fertile for a dramatic increase in violence. With court proceedings suspended in many of our countries during the lockdown, women who experienced these rising levels of violence actually had no recourse in many cases. And when they did, we started seeing actually reduced jail time for violence offenders, violence against women offenders, who were being sent back home to their victims after spending only a few hours in the police station, because law enforcement officers had more pressing issues to attend to with the pandemic. After all, it is socially and legally acceptable for a man to discipline and control his wife and children. Now, court closures have also resulted in deepening the suffering for women in Muslim family law contexts, where women were unable to file for divorce from abusive husbands, while men were still able to issue out-of-court unilateral verbal divorces. Wives and mothers had difficulties obtaining maintenance and were sometimes cruelly separated from their children because of difficulties obtaining child custody and guardianship rulings, which in some countries are the automatic right of the father. COVID-19 is glaringly showing us that inequality in family law and practices are the starting point. Suffering, beatings, killings, and suicides today are the end result. If this does not require our immediate attention and action, I really don't know what does. Now, the other issue the pandemic has exploded for us really is the drastic increase in women's domestic and care labor at home. Women found themselves suddenly having to take care of children and elders around the clock with no help, monitor hygiene rules at home, stock up rations and essentials, take care of sick family members, provide homeschooling support to children, and so on and on and on. Again, what has that got to do with our family laws and practices? Well, many of these laws assume that it is the role of women to perform unpaid domestic and care work, even though, and listen to this, interesting enough, that this contradicts settled classical Islamic jurisprudence, because Islamic jurisprudence does not obligate the wife with this kind of work. And actually, if she does that work, she has to be compensated. But the result is that some of our Muslim regions do not follow this classical juristic ruling, and oblige women by law to do this unpaid labor. And the result is most of our Muslim regions already have the highest rate of domestic work for women compared to men in the whole world, with women sometimes spending up to 5 times more time on unpaid domestic and care work than men. Additionally, when a woman works outside the home, she usually bears what is known as the double burden of work inside and outside the home. The WHO tells us that this results in time poverty, stress, and ill health for women, affecting the quality of their lives and relationships with those around them, including their family members. These gender stereotypes that are already legitimized in the law itself, which consider unpaid domestic and care work a woman's duty, make the situation worse at times of crisis such as COVID-19, when unpaid domestic labor suddenly spikes. It becomes very difficult for women to object or ask others in the family for help, despite the negative effect on women's health and the family's well-being. Because it becomes the woman's problem, not the family's and not the state's. It's her problem to find a solution for this. Now, beside women's health faltering, we are today seeing many women opting out of paid work to cope, threatening their own financial well-being, but also that of their families as well. So are men affected by any of this? Of course they're affected. We know from research that during ordinary times, the more unpaid domestic labor a woman does, the less paid labor she's able to do. This then increases the pressure on men to be the sole financial providers of their families. Surveys are showing us that this stress has been causing Arab men, for example, to experience ill health, arising cases of depression, and little time spent with their children, affecting the quality of that relationship. This is only becoming worse in the context of COVID-19 for men too. From another angle, unpaid care work has also been part of the reason why women prefer working in the informal sector, because it provides them with relative flexibility to juggle multiple roles within the family. The informal sector, however, has been one of the most hard-hit sectors by COVID-19, as you all know, greatly affecting women and their families. Activists in Morocco, for example, report that 20% of families are headed by women, and 70% of those are working in the informal sector. Now, as expected, most of them are now without a job, putting them and their families at great risk for survival. And so, family laws and practices, whether they lay the ground for inequality and violence against women, or oblige women to do unpaid domestic and care work, no matter what, are making the COVID situation much worse for women and their families. If the COVID-19 virus can talk, I think it would be telling us today, what are you waiting for to reform these laws? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marwa. I think it's really important for us to understand that the pandemic has exacerbated these underlying inequalities as opposed to, and also perhaps creating new ones because our legal systems and our court processes and so on are so weak to begin with. I'd like to turn to Hala. As the head of the Strategic Initiative for the Horn of Africa, your work specifically in the Greater Horn of Africa countries, which includes Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Somaliland, Uganda, and Ethiopia, to name a few. We see that similar to Asia, Africa has a diversity of plural legal systems, where in some countries, there are Muslim majority countries, family laws are either codified or exist in uncodified practices. What are you observing in light of what Zainah said in the Greater Horn of Africa countries, with regard to Muslim family laws and how Muslim women are affected more generally?
Thank you, Hyshyama, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's watching us at the moment. The truth of the matter that change is happening very, very slowly in the Greater Horn of Africa and across Eastern Africa based on our work within SIHA. And the reform of family laws, and its impact on women who are living either in predominantly Muslim society or in as minorities is very, very slow. Majority of the Horn of Africa countries has tried to adopt a system that does not upset the culture and traditions in that part of the world, including countries like, for example, Ethiopia or Uganda, who are claimed to champion women's rights. When it comes to family law, we will find a lot of gaps that tell us very clearly that the adoption of international treaties and such as CEDAW and the Child Rights Convention and so on, have been applied in a way that does not upset the traditional systems, or to try to reconcile as much as possible with the traditional system. And with with how people observe their set of beliefs. And in a broader term, there is nothing wrong with that. The problem comes with the fact that how does governments and countries across the region interprets the whole concepts of culture and traditions. It always comes to repressing women. So the plural legal system in that part of the world, it evolves around, enabling all the negative aspects, all the negative practices, negative cultural practices to continue happening, and to enable women repressions and marginalizations. And so for example, the Sharia court is parallelly active in Ethiopia, and is still very loyal to the concepts of traditional and Salafi Islam, which has an extremely negative impact on Muslim women in Ethiopia. In Uganda, most of the family cases is resolved, by referring, even in statutory courts, to traditions and culture, and it results in massive injustice. In Sudan and Somalia, both countries, they adopted an extremely militant and an extremely anti-women interpretations, when it comes to family law, enabling and legitimizing child marriage, legitimizing, bait al-ta'a, or the women obeying their husband, lack of domestic violence laws, and so on. So at the end of the day, women in that part of the world, they continue to be caught up in that paradoxical situations between their cultural identity, their beliefs, and their aspiration for justice and equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala, for laying that picture out. It's definitely one of the most complex regions, perhaps, when it comes to this interplay of customary, civil laws as well as traditional practices, and a lot of lessons learned from that, for the rest of us who have similar systems in our own context. I'd like to just remind the attendees and the participants, please do type in your Q&A if you have any questions for any of the panelists. Please don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A chat box, and my team will be curating that. We do have half an hour at the end of this talk show webinar to ask panelists your questions, so please do that. Hala, I want to follow up with you very quickly on what Marwa shared in terms of the situation with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Greater Horn of Africa is no stranger to the. Sorry, Sulav. Sorry, I thought I heard our translator. Sure. There's a request from our translators for the speakers to please slow down as we speak in order to ease the translation process. My apologies, I will do the same. That women living under discriminatory family laws in the region face with regard to the pandemic, and particularly the work that you have been doing at SIHA.
Shama, your question was not very clear. If you can just say it again. We lost you for a minute. I lost you for a minute.
Sure. Is it better now?
Much better, yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Can you please reflect on some of the challenges that women in the Greater Horn of Africa region face with regard to the pandemic situation, and particularly your research that SIHA did on this issue?
Thank you. I mean, what COVID-19 has done, it clearly exposed the weaknesses and the massive gaps in our legal system. It also exposed the poor investments of the countries within the Greater Horn of Africa on their citizens, but particularly on women and girls. And also COVID massively exposed the discrepancies within the laws and the lived realities of women. And I mean, despite the fact that many countries, of course, they are talking about ticking the boxes of women's rights, COVID-19 has showed us that there is a serious issue when it comes to the laws that protect women, which is most of the time in countries like Sudan and Somalia, it doesn't exist, or even if it exists in other countries, or South Sudan, in other countries, like Ethiopia or Uganda, it's not really enforced, and the orientation of the justice system and of the law enforcement is still far from actually enforcing protection. Our research has reflected that very, very clearly. For example, in Somalia, the incidence of gender killing or femicide were significantly rising, which is, it clearly speaks that, to the fact that the system of protection is not functioning at all. South Sudan, prevalence of child marriage, sexual violence against children, incidence of domestic violence is also increased. In Uganda, extreme incidence of domestic violence, and despite the fact that there is a policy to address gender-based violence, in Sudan, domestic violence cases were dramatically increased against the reality of a country that does not have a domestic violence policies, does not allow women, and this is applied also to Uganda, does not allowed women to access shelter because of the whole concept of Qiwama and Wilaya within the personal status law, and so on. In Ethiopia, despite the fantastic laws at the surface, the reality is women were extremely exposed, and there is a gap when it comes to protections. Another important issue that I think it's really important to pay attention to is the whole issue of militarizations and enabling, militarized forces that's being supported and equipped by the states to give them a green light to violate civilians and particularly women. COVID-19 has enabled militarization, has enabled brutality of different factions of militarized forces within the Greater Horn of Africa. It's a region that struggle with arms proliferations. There is no control of arms. There is different militia who are roaming in civilian spaces. This in addition to the massive impact and disparity, as Marwa has explained, on economically and poverty. I mean, over 85% of women in the Greater Horn of Africa are operating within the informal sector. They are vendors, they are domestic workers, and they are so on, within the urban settings or within the rural setting, working invisibly. So the fact that they had to work under such circumstances, at the same time encounter layers of violation. So outside, they are encountering the violence of, militarized forces and factions, being police or militia, and inside the home, confronted with domestic violence because they cannot meet the requirements of providing for the family as usual. So it's a very grim realities that COVID had actually exposed in that part of the world. In addition, of course, to the political tensions and possibilities of civil conflicts, which is currently happening in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hala. I'm getting a notification that my internet is unstable, so I hope you can hear me, but in case I drop out, do let me know. Zainah, I want to come back to you about after Hala's response. Groups like SIHA have really been at the forefront of advocacy when it comes to women's rights, but also human rights for the region. And and in fact, we can observe this around the world. Like you are the co-founder of an organization, Sisters in Islam, which we consider the mothership of the Muslim women's movement when it comes to family law reform, because it's essentially the resonance and the demand of the work of sis that grew into the global movement that is Musawah, of women confronting these issues that Hala and Marwa mentioned in their regions. Can you share with us the nature of advocacy specifically on Muslim family laws that you're observing from various national contexts, and why the campaign for justice in Muslim family laws was born? You might be on mute, Zainah.
Got it. Thank you, Hish, for that shout out to sis. Really, I think, it's what has been amazing over the past 10 to 15 years, especially, is the exponential growth, both in scholarship and activism on women's rights in Islam. Some 30 years ago, when Sisters in Islam was founded, we were about the only women's group that was speaking out publicly on the use and abuse of Islam to justify discrimination against women. And there was really not much scholarship that we could refer to. We had to do our own readings and develop our scholarship and a methodology, to challenge this use and abuse of Islam. And we challenged patriarchal authorities and created a voice and culture of public debate, arguing for our right to speak on Islam, in the ways it is understood, it is used as a source of law and public policy and practice. Basically, we sent notice that women will no longer shut up and will no longer accept any form of discrimination justified in the name of Islam. And what was important too, we offered an alternative, we offered a solution, we offered a vision of Islam that upholds equality and justice for women. As I always said, God cannot be God if God is unjust. What kind of God really would create the human race and then goes on to hobble, to discriminate against half of the human race that it created? That's not the work of God. It is the work of man. It is our utter belief in a just God and a just Islam that led Sisters in Islam. At that time, just 8 women with no office, no funds to do the work, to decide to study Islam for ourselves, to search for solutions to the problems women face in the name of Islam. And this is really important, we don't need for anyone to confer us authority to speak out. We conferred that authority on ourselves to speak out on Islam, to reclaim the justice of Islam. We created a public space. For us, it was important to do this publicly, to engage in debate and to develop an alternative discourse on Islam and women's rights and fundamental liberties in the context of the world we live in today. Really, in many Muslim countries, women like us are not recognized as having the authority or even the right to speak out on matters of religion. This supposedly belongs to the ulama. But we are telling the world that if this, and definitely those in authority over us in our countries, that if you want to use Islam as a source of law and public policy, then all of us, all citizens affected by these laws, have the right to speak out, engage, criticize, and demand reform if these laws bring about injustice. Actually, this is really what's taking place in the Muslim world today, and led by the women's movement, is exciting debate. Who's Islam? What Islam is the right Islam? This open contestation is critical in countries where Islam is used to govern our lives in laws and practice. The groundbreaking work of Sisters in Islam led to the birth of Musawah as a global movement in response to demands by women's groups in other Muslim countries on the need to understand Islam better in order to be more effective in their advocacy for reform within the conservative, patriarchal Muslim context that we all live in. Musawah's work in the areas of knowledge building, capacity building, and international advocacy has led to what today is a phenomenal change. We see more and more women's groups engage with Islam and advocacy for reform, challenging misogynistic interpretations and bringing to the public space new feminist understandings of Islam. Women are asserting our voice in the production of knowledge in Islam, and how that knowledge is then used to codify laws and make policy. It is this knowledge and the conviction that reform towards equality and justice is possible in Islam that is giving women courage to stand up and speak out and challenge patriarchal authorities in our tradition. Today, you see amazing activism in many parts of the Muslim world where Muslim women are demanding change, offering egalitarian rights-based understanding of Islam to push for reform. Many of them are with us today. Yeah, all of you who are attending this global conference. With knowledge, women develop courage to challenge the idea of male authority and dominance that are seen as inherently Islamic. It is not. So you see, for example, in India, the group BMMA challenged the core practice of triple talaq and won their case in court. They have also developed a model law to support their demand for codification of Muslim family law based on marriage as a partnership of equals. They're even training women as judges to set up women's courts to hear cases and reach settlements that are more just. If the men are not going to give us justice, we're going to deliver justice. In Sri Lanka, a young women's group, the Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group, went to the ground and documented the discriminations Muslim women suffered in the Qadi court system. And based on these findings, reality ground, they launched a campaign to reform the Discriminatory Muslim Marriages and Divorce Act and brought their case to the CEDAW committee in Geneva to push the Sri Lankan government to take steps to amend the law. They made compelling arguments using Islamic legal concepts and tools and worked with sisters and worked with Musawah to support their demands for reform. And today, the Sri Lankan government and even Muslim leaders there are responding positively to their call for comprehensive reform of the Marriage and Divorce Act. In South Africa, another newly formed group, the Muslim Personal Law Network, now occupies the public space. Guys, I cannot emphasize enough how important that this work has to be done in the public space, because change is not going to happen by tiptoeing behind four walls. Yeah, so they're occupying the public space in their demand for recognition of Muslim marriages and raising their voice on various issues of discrimination Muslim women face in obtaining rights upon divorce in areas such as maintenance, claims to marital assets, protection from eviction of the marital home. In Indonesia, just amazing work in Indonesia, where Musawah's partner Alimat worked with the Congress of Women Ulama, KUPI, that brought together over 500 grassroots women religious leaders from all over Indonesia in a historic 3-day meeting that issued fatwas. Fatwas are usually given by male ulama, but these women religious leaders who are ulama, who are scholars, of Islam, they issued fatwas against child marriage and domestic violence. Their work, their powerful voice, grounded in their cultural and religious roots, contributed to the Indonesian government eventually raising the age of marriage for women to 19. In Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, women's groups and their allies campaigned to repeal the penal code provisions that allow a rapist to escape punishment if he married the victim. Well, this is not a family law provision. Research shows that such marriages usually ended in violence or divorce, and in some cases, even suicide of the bride, indicating that the impunity and criminality of such a law cannot be the basis of a healthy marriage and family. In many other countries, women's groups, women's commissions, so women's commissions are also now pushing for law reform, and a Muslim family law reform, are now publicly challenging the ways Islam is used to justify discrimination on a whole range of issues, child marriage, polygamy, equal right to divorce, custody of children, division of marital assets. This is evidenced by the kinds of requests for support, for Islamic arguments, for good practices in Muslim countries. That's what they want, good practices in Muslim countries, so that that Musawah, we in Musawah continuously are getting. They need to show their governments and their religious authorities that other Muslim countries have moved forward, with law reform to end discrimination. What this campaign for justice hopes to do is really to galvanize this growing activism and advocacy that's happening in many Muslim countries into a global movement for Muslim family law reform. The time is now, there is momentum, there are global spaces opening up with Beijing +25 and sustainable development goals to be achieved by 2030. And not least, as Marwa said, this time of multiple crises, because of the pandemic, when the world is searching for solutions to end the gross inequalities that exist today. This urgent process to build back a better world must address centuries-old discrimination against women. A better world must recognize the full humanity of women. It's as simple as that. That's not rocket science, that women are human beings of equal worth and dignity. So we see our campaign for justice and Muslim family laws as integral to this global discussion and debate to end the deeply intertwined systemic inequalities and injustices of this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainah. I mean, every response of yours is literally like a tweetable, every sentence is a tweetable moment, but also there's so much resonance in terms of, yes, we again see so much discrimination, and women face on multiple fronts injustices, but there's also this amazing resilience and activism that's coming from around the world. And Marwa, I know you have many more examples to what Zainah mentioned, but I really want to ground ourselves again in the face of this pandemic, and be cognizant that some of the policy, legislative, and procedural changes are more urgent and immediate, and they're timely, and they need to happen now. So from the survey findings, but also from your work in the MENA region, what are some specific recommendations that women's rights activists have for governments and service providers in order to address the most urgent issues that women face today? And I'll have a follow-up question for you in terms of the long run, but for now, the pandemic.
Okay, sure. So Musawah's survey definitely shows us two key recommendations on the short and medium terms that would help us address the problems our women are facing in the family today in the context of the pandemic. The first is improving access to justice. I'm going slow for the translation. And the second is responding to gender-based violence and discrimination. Now, for the first point on improving access to justice, quick justice delivery in courts, especially family law courts, need to be made available during crisis situations like these. So some of the recommendations to do that were, number one, to organize remote functioning of courts and court hearings virtually via telephone, video conference calls during times of lockdown, for example. But then applicants obviously need to have access to mobile landline phones, and network reception internet services for that to happen. Second is to open the possibility for the application of cases to be filed and held online. And some countries have started doing that already. And to simplify the procedures for doing so. We also need to ensure that, to make provisions really for those who cannot submit cases via the internet, that they can do so via other means. Now, the third is accessibility and availability of information and technology has to be made available to women who need to attend court sessions remotely. Provisions need to be made for family hearings with multiple parties as well. And fourth, we need an efficient system in place to ensure follow-ups on domestic violence cases, protection orders, maintenance, and so on, which are left unattended during times of crisis. For the second set of recommendations on responding to gender-based violence and discrimination, these were some of the recommendations coming forward. Number one, to establish a pandemic-related institutional emergency reaction and response system, for example. Two, to prioritize and resource psychosocial and legal support for victims of gender-based violence early on in the outbreak. it matters, yeah? And it was evident that women were subjected to more harm, and early on doing these things really reduces that kind of harm. Number three, to ensure the provision of operational accessible shelters and temporary homes for victims of abuse. And four, we have seen that the helpline centers that were set up by state and non-state organizations have actually proved to be crucial during the pandemic in protecting women and marginalized communities. Five, to allocate a pandemic-based state fund for gender-based violence. You know, we need the money. Nothing's going to happen without the money. Yeah. So we need these funds for that and for other essential services for women and girls in times of crisis. Number six, to place more emphasis on gendered reporting of violence during pandemics. Then we can use that for future referencing and drafting new guidelines and policies. And seven, we definitely need quick and effective police intervention. Yeah, this is a priority issue for the police as well, not just the pandemic related stuff. So we need also a strong coordination of local authorities and accessibility to support systems during pandemics. And finally, the final recommendation was to increase accessibility and availability of transportation to police stations during pandemics. Now, these are all interventions that can be organized on the short and medium terms. However, they do not preclude the important need for a longer term kind of solution that reaches to the roots. We still need to do something about the entrenched infrastructure of inequality that ensures the suffering of the most marginalized in our societies. Family laws are part of that infrastructure of violence that cause suffering during ordinary times and compound that suffering during times of crisis such as COVID-19. We know that reforming our family laws, as we've heard from Zainah and from Hala as well, that our family laws can be reformed towards more gender equality and justice, and that it's both necessary and possible to avoid these harsh scenarios we're witnessing today. And we're here to make that happen together. Thank you.
Thanks, Marwa, for that timely intervention. For everyone interested, the policy paper based on the COVID-19 pandemic and impacts on women living under Muslim family laws is being finalized with our researcher Sumaya Palak, as well as the internal Musawah team, and will be available on our website by the end of December for some holiday reading. But really, what it does is draw these links that Marwa was talking about, and the examples that Hala was sharing, and place family law and situate family law in light of the pandemic situation. And Marwa, you're absolutely right when it comes to saying that the crisis again only exacerbates the underlying inequalities. And I want to ask you, what are some, in the interest of time, I want to ask you, what are some different ways that reforms can happen in the longer term? What are some pathways? And if you can explain it to us, so that we're running a little out of time. So just a very quick short answer so we can give a little bit more time to Hala as well to respond to the next question.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'm not going to go into the reasons why Muslim family laws have been historically a very difficult process to come about. Yeah, it's a process that is intriguingly entangled with so many sensitive and volatile issues like identity politics, power, political power alliances and interests between ruling elites and religious authorities. And of course, the deeply entrenched day-to-day patriarchal interests of men and sometimes women, yeah, in the private and public spheres. However, history and experience have really shown us that reform nevertheless did happen, yeah? And reformers succeeded in doing so through a variety of ways or pathways, as you say, Hyshyama. One was by going back to Islamic texts and finding arguments for reform from our rich jurisprudential history spanning the past 1,400 years. We need to make use of our rich history. We need to go back to it, mine it, dig it, re-engage with it. So, for example, you find reformers in Morocco, they used fiqh-based arguments, juristic arguments, to remove the wifely duty of obedience from the Moroccan family law. Lawmakers in Tunisia resorted to relevant Quranic verses. They resorted to the Quran to absolutely ban polygamy. In Egypt, you find religious authorities built on the juristic concept of maslaha, public interest, and the necessity of rida, consent in marriage, to set the minimum age of marriage at 18 for girls and boys. They used our tradition to do these things. And I urge you again to look at Musawah's positive developments table that Zainah has shown us to see a variety of these kinds of reforms. Now, when it was difficult to reform the substantive family law for whatever reason, reformers still managed to make it happen through a variety of other methods. For example, they chose to amend the procedural instead of the substantive laws, such as in Algeria, Jordan, and Egypt, where they made the much easier divorce procedure of khula finally available to women in courts. So here, they actually took the procedural law route instead of the substantive. In Palestine, they passed an administrative directive to notify the first wife of the husband's intention to be polygamous as an attempt to limit the practice. On another front, the Bank of Palestine also recently issued an administrative policy allowing mothers to open bank accounts for their children, a right that was reserved only for the male guardian, typically the father, who had the exclusive financial wilaya or guardianship over the children. So here they took the procedural law or administrative decisions route. The third mechanism of reform has been to pass new laws altogether, such as domestic violence laws in Saudi Arabia and Morocco, or to amend other existing laws, such as the penal code in Singapore, where the big taboo, marital rape, was finally criminalized for both Muslims and non-Muslims. A fourth possible pathway for reform has been ensuring consistency of laws with the national constitution. This was used in Tunisia to address a typically difficult and stubborn issue. Guess what? Inheritance. Yes, they used that to amend the legal rulings on inheritance to provide for more equality between men and women. In Algeria and Turkey, it was used to instill an overriding governing legal principle of equality between spouses in family-related laws. Finally, when law reform proved difficult, states gave courts more powers to exercise court scrutiny in providing or withholding permission for polygamy in Morocco or the marriage of minors in Jordan, for example. In other countries, we find experiences of judicial activism in courts. Yeah, the judges themselves took action and they were given the space to do that. That gave Muslim women the right to marry non-Muslim men in Tunisia, for example. Morocco, we find that in the absence of a clear article criminalizing marital rape in the law, some judges actually punished husbands who committed this crime against their wives. Yes, marital rape is a crime, yeah? And they punished the husband that did that by using the general rape articles in the penal code. However, it should be noted that no matter what pathway, method, or route of reform that was adopted in any of these countries, both research and practice is showing us that the single most important factor that pushed for these reforms to happen has actually been the women's movement. It was actually women's groups who raised these issues, built the knowledge, mobilized alliances, pressured lawmakers, bravely faced the demonization and death threats, appealed to humanity and divinity, and actually created the political moment and grabbed it when it was available to make the change. And so in the end, as I always say, kudos to them and to all of you with us here today who are involved in this kind of brave and beautiful work, wherever you are. Thank you. So Hyshyama, are you there? Probably. Okay.
Please, you're muted. Wait, is he frozen?
Apologies, I'm having some technical issues. And Marwa, unfortunately, I didn't hear you end. You have completed your response, yes?
I have.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I missed the last few minutes. But I really want to turn to Hala to reflect on what Zainah and what Marwa has been saying. Is there a conversation on Muslim family laws happening within the region, or is it long overdue? And is there a resonance of this global conversation and activism on Muslim family laws for activists in the countries that you're working in?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to reflect here on, first of all, just it definitely, what Marwa and Zainah is saying, it echoes, our struggle, and it echoes, the impact of, of the fact that we are still struggling to have a just family law that humanize our societies and respond to the aspiration of women for equality and justice in the region. But I'd like to reflect also on our strategy in SIHA, intersectionality is the key word that we are adopting within SIHA when we are approaching the injustice that's occurring as a result of either lack of family laws completely in specific countries like Uganda or South Sudan, or a family law that's based completely in undermining and discriminating against women, or a family law that exists within a plural legal systems that enables still violations to occur, like in the situation of Ethiopia. And what I meant when I said intersectionality, the fact that we understand that family law is where the core violation, it's the source of the core violation that could happen and occurs against women, and it absolutely intersects with the criminal laws. It intersects with citizenship laws, intersects with policies, intersects with labor laws, and so it's really important when we look at family law to see the implications of family laws or personal status laws in our parts of the world. How is this actually impacting every single aspects of women existence? And this is why what's being said by Marwa and Zainah, it's really very, very important. We cannot afford as activists not to get into conversations about and not to navigate why family laws are really difficult to unpack and to talk about in our parts of the world. And in a different word, I'd like to say that it's really critical and important for us as activists and people and as women who are aspiring change, not to shy away from understanding the politics behind this well construct, that's well-built construct that repress women and disabling us from moving forward. So we shouldn't shy away from understanding the politics behind it, and we shouldn't shy away from interrogating it, whether speaking about religion or cultural practices, and it's and this is why it's really important to look at the work that Musawah is doing, navigating concepts of enlightenments and possibilities of different interpretations and aspirations for justice and equalities within Islam, for religion, within Islam, and how women should be treated equally. There is something that's also very, very important I would like to highlight, talking about the strategies and how we should move forward. I think it's also very, very important for us as activists and as feminists to own our issues, and not to treat it as because as international issues. What happened is often women's rights is being framed not as national issues in our part of the world. It's most of the time it's connected to NGOs, to international causes, and the reality is women issues and challenges that faces women are 100% national issues, and they should be adopted and absorbed as national issues. and that's really very important positions, you know, for activists to take, especially in my part of the world. Our governments, you know, they use women rights as a tool to tick the box and you know, and to get approval globally, you know, while they don't care about the struggle and the suffering of women internally. And this is why efforts towards meaningful reform often doesn't take place. So it's very, very important, you know, for activists, you know, to look at women issues as, you know, as a national agenda, and contextualize it and connect it, you know, to the day-to-day struggle and the lived realities of women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hala. I mean, what you said really strongly resonated, you know, with the work that that the group that I'm a part of is trying to do in Sri Lanka as well in terms of Muslim marriage and reforming the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. It's essentially trying to make it a national conversation and take it out of the, you know, situate it out of just it being a community problem or a Muslim problem to it being actually a constitutional problem and a problem that, you know, that has to do with the country's legal system. And that actually has been quite successful in terms of making it a dinner table topic for everyone and bringing it to the public domain, as Zainah mentioned. Zainah, I have my last question for you, but actually in the interest of time, there's a similar question that's coming from the participant, one of the participants as well. So I'm going to merge the Q&A and your final question and ask you this question. So from the participant, from one of the participants, we've received this question in terms of there are many negative experiences that we're hearing, you know, with regard to the COVID situation, with regard to, you know, the regional, in region, like the MENA region, as well as everywhere in the world, literally, where there is discriminatory Muslim family laws that women are facing many issues. What can activists, so number one, what can activists and ordinary citizens do to help address this situation? And going back to my question for you, what is the trajectory then that Musawah is envisioning for the campaign for justice? And how is this global conference, which we're currently at, that started today, going to feed into that co-creating process? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hish. Yeah, you know, very often, you know, we do get like the problem seems so overwhelming. What can we as ordinary citizens, as ordinary women do? Really, I always bring the example of Sisters in Islam, you know, when we began 30 years ago, and then all these amazing groups that I mentioned earlier, how, you know, they started organizing, like Hish's group in Sri Lanka that just went to the ground and documented the cases of discrimination that women suffer, and from that lived reality, created this media buzz and attention and developed memes and you know, and all kinds of media strategies to get their voice heard in the public space and to get the issues heard in the public space. As Hala said, how this is so important, it has to be a national issue. It has to break out of our community and be presented in the public space as an urgent, critical national issue, a constitutional issue, yeah, a public life issue, a public well-being issue. So it's, but you know, when you deal with Islam, you will be criticized. There will be a lot of resistance because there are so many, you know, there are powerful people with power and authority over you who do not want to see change, yeah, because they benefit from this concept of male authority over women. So they don't want to change it. So you need knowledge and you need courage. When Sisters began 30 years ago, there was no such, all this knowledge that exists today did not exist then. We had to meet every week in my house to read the Quran for ourselves, to find out whether the Quran exactly says what these men in authority say, yeah, that a man has a right to beat his wife, he has a right to 4 wives, he has a right to demand obedience and all that. But now there is so much scholarship, and not just scholarship. You know, what Sisters in Islam, what Musawah have been trying to do is to try and package this scholarship in small ways, to make it easy for activists and for ordinary women on the ground to understand, what Islam actually says in terms of justice and equality for women. So the knowledge is amazing. It's out there on the website. You can read it for yourself. But I won't advise doing this work alone. You just form a small group. Sisters in Islam began with just 8 women, and we just created not just a national voice, but an international voice. Yeah, of course, at a time when no other voices were speaking out in the way that Sis was speaking out. So of course we made news, but really in the end, you don't need, for now, to start with 100 women. Start with 5 women, with 8 women. Meet regularly and develop your strategies. How are you going to speak out? What are the issues you want to raise? Take it out to the public space and offer your alternative vision of Islam. So create a public tradition of debate, of an alternative discourse of Islam that upholds equality and justice, and argue for that, Islam, that just, compassionate, kind Islam, to be the Islam that governs our lives today. And really, in terms of what Musawah is trying to do, by building this campaign is, basically research has shown that the most important contributor to reform of discriminatory laws and practices, be it violence against women, female genital mutilation, sexual reproductive health and rights, is the women's movement. Yeah, so if we want to see an end to discrimination against women in our family laws, we need to organize, we need to mobilize and build a strong movement for the transformation that we want to see to bring about justice for women in the Muslim family and in our own national context. So the campaign, as designed for now, is a 5-year campaign, for Muslim family law reform. Together with all of you, we hope to build a global collective force for change, a visible network, so a loud, visible, present network of activists advancing Muslim family law reform at the national, so we hope groups will form at the national level, regional and global levels. And we hope after this conference that we will have small groups, in the same way that CIS began with a small study group of 8 women, small groups will emerge, at the thematic level on contentious issues such as child marriage, polygamy, marital property, or groups will emerge at the regional level, and how we can together join hands to build knowledge, to strategize, and importantly, to build public support. That's why doing this in the public space is important, because we need to change public opinion to support the possibility of reform towards equality and justice. And we hope the campaign for justice, can act as a platform to provide support, strengthen capacities, share resources and strategies, and build solidarities across issues and across regions. And given that we're challenging male authority over women and engaging with religion, culture, and tradition, like I said, we will be attacked. So collective strength is important. Solidarity is important. Make sure you have allies, who will support you if you are attacked, So, and it is collective strength and solidarity that will give you, that will enable you to stand your ground in the face of resistance. So consider this campaign as your ally. And many groups, women's groups that started their advocacy work on family law reform in the 1970s and 80s gave up because it was just too difficult and too controversial, dealing with a law that is based on religion and facing the backlash, like, oh, this is just too much, But really, like I said, times have changed today. There are all this scholarship that exists, there's this activism that exists, so let us all work together. And we also have plans to link this campaign for reform with another global campaign for equality in family law that is going to be across all regions, religions, cultures, and tradition. And this global campaign will bring all groups working on family law reform from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, from the MENA region, and Musawah hopefully will be that linkage between the global campaign and the Muslim world. So there are all these incredible, exciting possibilities and opportunities moving forward. You know, and we really want to hear more from all of you on how we can move forward together and co-create this movement for family law reform. And you can begin, if you've not already organized at the national level, I really, really do hope you will begin now, because the resources are available, the platforms are available for you to organize and for you to join hands with all of us throughout the Muslim world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zainah. I think you've managed to actually respond to about 2 or 3 questions around around the same topic. So this is great. In the interest of time, I would really like to go into the Q&A. Unfortunately, we have around 15 minutes left. And so I will do something unorthodox and merge questions for one question, which will encompass a few different questions for Marwa and you, Zainah. But so can I just quickly go to the next next slide, just to remind everybody attending that this is the first in a series of webinars. We have these amazing webinars that our team has put together, you know, with scholars. The next webinar is with Muslim women scholars, looking at Islamic jurisprudence, legal tradition, the patriarchal structures within it. So please, if you haven't registered, do register for it. We also have a fantastic webinar on art and activism and transforming pain to power, which is, you know, which we know will be really great. And then we have our last webinar is in fact with Muslim women activists, including Hala, and 5 other countries who are leading movements within their own national context in terms of reforming Muslim family laws. So please do register for this amazing lineup that we have for you. So if we can end the slide share, I will quickly go through a question each for the participants. Zainah, something you said also resonated in terms of what there was a comment about it, which I think you responded to really, really well. And I'd like Marwa to jump in here. Marwa, one of the comments we got from the participant was, Muslim women's groups are fighting for women's rights, but some have excluded themselves from platforms like Musawah due to the equation of Musawah with Western feminists and Western human rights. But what Zainah said was, we're actually working, you know, on Muslim women's issues because we're Muslim, and it's coming from a much more deeper place. And you've faced this tension quite often. Can you please speak to this? And I'd like Hala to respond to the same question afterwards.
Sure. So I think there's an assumption made here that human rights are this Western product that we need to stay away from. Interesting fact, we Muslim countries have contributed to the writing of these human rights documents. CEDAW, you had so many Muslim countries actually contribute to the writing of CEDAW in the 70s. And interestingly, some of the issues raised in CEDAW were absolutely no problem for Muslim countries, whereas in other Christian countries, there were issues, yeah? So for example, things like family planning, we were much more open about it. So I think it's important to realize what is human rights? And is there a problem between Sharia and human rights, or is there a common ground? Because really, when we say that Sharia is against human rights, we're actually not doing Sharia a favor, because Sharia is about human rights. Sharia is about dignity, it's about justice, it's about equality, yeah? Even before the human rights framework came into being, we had that there. But I don't want to be lame by saying we had it already, but what did we do with it? This conference, these kinds of movements are trying to actualize what Sharia came with into reality, okay? So it's very important. I would recommend that you read, for example, all the work that Musawah has done about the common ground between Sharia and human rights. And it's very important to understand the difference between Sharia and fiqh. Sharia is the divine message from God. It does not change with time and place. Fiqh is the human endeavor that tries to understand Sharia and makes it into a legal ruling. Now, fiqh, yes, patriarchal fiqh is against human rights. because it's patriarchal. But patriarchal fiqh is not Sharia. Sharia is divine. So we need to understand the meanings of certain terms before we start attacking one thing or the other. Now, it's also very important can I jump into another thing and link with it? Yeah?
Yes, please. There's also, a related one, which I think you can see here as well in terms of political will.
Yes.
How to advocate for Muslim family law reforms as a sexy topic on political platforms. So please do speak to the question and then your response.
Precisely, that's what I wanted to move on to. So this excellent question by Liana Khairuddin, how to make Muslim family law reform sexy for governments. Yeah, one of the ways to make it sexy for governments is to show them the economic cost these Muslim family laws are costing us today. So the violence, for example, how much is the violence costing us? In countries like Egypt, estimates are 30% of GDP, national GDP. When the Egyptian government hears that, and with the amount of poverty we have, this is an incentive for the government to start moving and doing something about it. Things like unpaid domestic labor, that these laws are making women do. The lost opportunity of having women work in the paid sector and how much to the GDP they could have contributed, for example. Of course, we need to be careful because women should not be seen as, like little levers in the whole big capitalist machine. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to show these governments the economic cost of these laws, these family laws. Other way to do it, I mean, Zainah has spoken about a lot of ways, but the other way to do it is to engage with these human rights mechanisms. Why is human rights being so vilified? Because they make it so inconvenient for autocratic governments to operate the way they want. So sometimes engaging with the human rights system is actually a very good way of starting a dialogue for the local women's movement to start the dialogue with its government, with its political regimes. So maybe that's another way of doing it. It's a tool, it's a mechanism. No one is saying that human rights is Quran. It's not. It's a tool, it's a mechanism that we can use. The other thing is just to simply be troublemakers. We have been doing research for a paper we're going to issue very soon about the different strategies that have been used for Muslim family law reform across the years over a lot of different countries. And the one thing that keeps coming up for us is the persistence of the women's movement. Keep pushing, keep asking. Sometimes the government they will make the change because they want to get rid of that headache.
Right.
So this is one of the final ways to do it. The last thing is lived reality, and it's related to a COVID question, but I can answer it later if you want.
Yes, we might not have time for that. However, just a reminder that for everyone who is joining us, in the for the conference, we'll be happy to have these discussions and questions and debates on Slack and any other platform as well. But Hala, just before you jump into what Marwa said, and please do add to that, I also want to bring out another question for you, which I think is important. So the question says, do you think the main problem is patriarchal, quote unquote, extremist interpretations of the Quran towards women in countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, or is it local culture of stereotyping that criminalizes women in these countries? That's so far known as, the territory of radical Islam. And where does human rights then structure into this discussion?
Thank you so much, Hyshyama. Well, I think, the problem is really complex, extremely complex. And I think it's largely connected to the political structure of the region and the geopolitics of the Greater Horn of Africa. I mean, the region has been a playground, and a proxy for a long, long time for many, many countries, and of course the poverty of the region and have made it very vulnerable, to those kind of very obstructive and dark ideas. And it's largely also blocking, or obstructing the reform. So it makes our work much more difficult, because there is privilege, there is interests, and there is groups that they find it at this point very difficult to let go of the privileges they gain through religious interpretations or cultural interpretations, and so on. So and it's really complex to talk about that, but I think it's also something that very important for the activists and for the women movement who are working in that part of the world to have clarity and understanding, of what does it mean to address and engage with religion in that part of the world. I'd like to touch on what on what Marwa has been saying, and the fight against or the fight for a just family laws. I think it's a broader fight. I think it's a fight for a paradigm shift. We want to reconstruct, a new setup, at the political, social, cultural, and economic level, where women have equal access and treated equally. And that in itself, it's such a complex battle. And I'd recall, someone that's, very important, for Musawah and for all of us, and for me personally, quote Ziba when she always say, Ziba Mir Husseini, the professor of religious anthropology and legal anthropology, and one of the founders of Musawah, when she said that religion is way too important to be left for men, and I think this is very, very important quote for activists. Myself, I took that very, very seriously, in terms of our rights as women with faith, as women who are part of a society, and as women who refuse to be subordinates. And from there, what I would like to stress, that alienating culture, alienating religion, alienating faith in our struggle, for rights and equality, and mainly relying, on the human rights framework, which is, I totally agree with Marwa, that we equally contributed to that, through our presence within the United Nations, but also through our pioneer experiences. Muslim countries, they have, a very solid feminist movements, early on, from the 1920s, early 20th century in Egypt, in my country, Sudan, from the 1940s, we have a very strong led feminist movement that fought, in the anti-colonialism movement and so on. So it's really important to own that, and to own the human rights framework, and to understand that, we contributed to that. But also it's really important, not to alienate ourselves from who we are, from our culture, from our religion, and not to be afraid from interacting with our religion. And I think that's really a very important debate, for the feminist movement in the different countries need to have. Ourselves, in SIHA, we went through that. It wasn't easy. Often, we were accused that, we are anti-human rights. This is such a mess. How come we don't touch on religion? It's you cannot handle. It's all coming from a notion of subordination. Even for people who believe that it's only the human rights framework, it's the assumption that feminists and women cannot actually interrogate, and they don't have the capacity to interrogate and engage with religion. And that's something that's completely discriminatory. And we need to resist it, and we need to fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what the three of you have managed to do within this 1.5 hours is set this issue, describe it globally, describe it regionally, describe it country specifically, situate it in this COVID pandemic situation in terms of what is needed in the short term and long term. So there's been a lot of rich conversation that has happened here today. And I very strongly want to encourage everyone who's listening in to please tune into our future webinars. The one happening tomorrow, in fact, if you're interested in, Islamic framework, Islamic legal tradition, the panel tomorrow will be debunking myths and assumptions that have informed discriminatory practices within Muslim legal tradition. So that's a really, really interesting webinar for, that we have prepared for you. But in the interest of time, unfortunately, we're unable to take any more questions. And I would like, while Zainah, I'll give Zainah the last 2 minutes for any concluding comments, especially for everyone who's been joining us outside of the conference, but also for our conference participants. Final 2 comments while Suri, my colleague Suri, puts up the poll. I think then we can manage time a bit better. So yes, Zainah, over to you.
Yeah, just quickly, the issue of political will. Look, we all live in countries where our governments and our political leaders lack the political will to advance women's rights and lack the political courage to deal with Islam and the power of mobilization that Islamists in many of our countries are able to do. So really then, to wait for our government to deliver change to us, that's not going to happen. To wait for them to build a political will is not going to happen. We need to make it politically costly for our governments and our religious authorities to continue to ignore our voice. And the way we can make it costly is in the way that Islamist groups organize. We need to organize, we need to mobilize, we need to make our voice heard, we need to be loud in the public space so that those in authority realize, including those in religious authority, that there is a cost. There's a political cost, a cost to their power and their authority if they continue to discriminate against us and to promote this Islam that makes no sense to the realities of our lives today. So it's really, really important, that I really hope over the next 5 days that this conference is going to generate the interest and the energy and the hope to bring all of you together really so that we can organize, we can mobilize and make our voice heard and make it politically costly for our governments to continue to ignore us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for their inspiring words and so much information packed into 1.5 hours. Also, a huge thank you to the support 15 sessions that we have prepared for the conference, ready for you. Suri, particularly Zul for this conference, for this particular webinar on the back end, and all our volunteers. Thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing this webinar as well. And for everyone listening in, your sustained attention at 95 to 100 participants since when we began is amazing. Thank you for giving us your time. And we will join. And we hope that you will join us in the next one. Marwa will actually be back for the last panel, and Hala will be back for that same panel as well. So you will be able to speak to and see them and hear from them again. Till then, stay safe, please, and have a wonderful day.